My name is Grace Whitmore, and the day my grandmother's will was read, my mother told me I should be grateful to get anything at all. She said it with that delicate cruelty she'd perfected over the years, a smile that could slice through bone. I remember the smell of her perfume, sharp and expensive, as she leaned in and whispered, "Try not to embarrass us today, Grace." I didn't respond. I didn't have to, because by the end of that afternoon, the entire room would go silent, and for once in my life, they would all finally see me. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And before we start, don't forget to subscribe and support this channel so I can keep sharing more true stories that'll make you laugh, cry, and question everything you thought you knew about family. The law office smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish, the kind of place where secrets are traded in whispers. Outside the tall windows, the Boston skyline was just beginning to turn gold under the late autumn sun. Inside, time felt suspended. 3 generations of my family gathered in one room, pretending civility while waiting to see what Grandma Evelyn had left behind. My mother, Elaine, stood near the window, phone in hand, her red nails gleaming as she scrolled through photos of houses she thought she'd soon own. My sister, Lydia, sat with her legs crossed, humming softly, her pearl earrings catching the light like tiny crowns. I was the quiet one in the corner, the daughter who never quite fit the family picture. For as long as I could remember, I'd been the one who held everything together in silence. The bills, the birthday reminders, the messes no one else wanted to clean. Lydia was the golden child, born with what my mother called natural charm. She could break things and be forgiven with a laugh. I could save things and still be blamed when they fell apart. That's how it always was. Until Grandma Evelyn changed everything. You see, my grandmother had a way of seeing the truth that others refused to. When I was 12, I overheard her tell my mother, "You mistake noise for brilliance." Elaine laughed it off, but I never forgot it. Evelyn believed that some people shine too loudly and others too quietly, and that the quiet ones are usually the ones carrying the real light. I didn't know then how deeply that belief would shape my future. That morning, when I walked into the law office, the secretary gave me a gentle smile, the kind reserved for the overlooked. "They're already inside," she said. I could hear my mother's laughter from down the hall. It was the sound of someone rehearsing victory. The mahogany door opened to reveal a conference room that could have belonged in a movie. High ceilings, long polished table, brass light fixtures that caught every nervous reflection. Lydia was already perched at the head of the table, her phone out, camera tilted just enough to capture what I could only assume would be her heir to the estate selfie later. My mother gestured toward the chair at the far end, away from the lawyers, away from the center of the conversation. I took it without argument. "Grace," Lydia said, glancing at me, "I hope you didn't take the day off work for this. Grandma didn't exactly leave much to, you know." She trailed off, but smirked anyway. "She always said she wanted to keep things simple," my mother added. "The house, the jewelry, a bit of savings, nothing extravagant." Then she turned to Lydia, her tone softening instantly. "But you'll make it shine, sweetheart. Grandma adored you. Adored." That word stung more than it should have. I folded my hands in my lap, staring at the edge of the conference table. It was the same shade of wood as the kitchen counter where Grandma Evelyn used to brew her tea. I could still picture her hands, steady, wrinkled, confident, as she poured steaming water into 2 mismatched cups. She'd say, "Sugar hides the bitterness, Grace, but it doesn't make it disappear. Learn the difference." I hadn't realized at the time how much she was teaching me, not just about tea, but about people. The lawyer entered then, Mr. Shaw, a man in his 60s with kind eyes that held the gravity of what he was about to unleash. Behind him followed another woman in a tailored navy suit carrying a locked briefcase. My mother noticed her immediately. "2 lawyers?" she whispered, eyebrows arching. "That's odd." Lydia shrugged. Maybe Grandma's estate was more complicated than we thought. I didn't say it out loud, but I wanted to. Complicated didn't begin to cover it. The meeting hadn't even begun, and already the air was thick with expectation. My mother adjusted her silk scarf, the one she wore to every important event, as if it were armor. Lydia kept refreshing her phone, probably imagining the social posts she'd make once she inherited a classic New England property. And me? I sat still, letting the tension settle around me like fog, because I'd learned long ago that silence can be its own kind of weapon. It's strange how people reveal themselves when they think the world is about to reward them. My mother's voice grew softer, sweeter, her tone laced with a kind of false humility that always came right before a big ask. Evelyn had such a generous heart, she said to no one in particular, maybe even to herself. She always said family comes first. Lydia nodded vigorously. She told me last Christmas she wanted me to have the lake house someday. She said that? My mother smiled as if fate had just handed her confirmation. Then that settles it. Across the room, I noticed a photo on the bookshelf, a black and white image of the Boston Harbor, waves breaking against a lighthouse. It reminded me of Evelyn's favorite saying, "Lighthouses don't chase ships, they just stand there and shine." Maybe that's what I was doing now, standing quietly, waiting for the storm to reveal who would stay afloat. I glanced at the clock. The second hand moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each tick echoing louder than the last. The lawyers were late, but that only added to the performance. My mother started pacing. Lydia scrolled through real estate listings, and I studied the light creeping across the table. It looked like the kind that used to fill Evelyn's sunroom in the afternoons. The same place where she taught me about her little side projects. Most people thought she was a retired librarian who collected antique spoons. They didn't know about the business calls that came through at odd hours, the thick folders marked confidential, or the quiet pride in her voice when she said, "Knowledge is power, but preparation is freedom." I'd spent the past 3 years helping her catalog every file, every document, every ledger. At the time, I thought it was just her way of keeping busy. Now I wasn't so sure. Lydia broke the silence first. "You know, Mom, when I redo the house, I'm thinking modern coastal. Light blue, white marble, open concept. Grandma's decor was so vintage." Elaine laughed. "She had good taste, but it's time to update. And the jewelry, we'll get it appraised, of course, but that sapphire brooch alone could pay for the renovation." They were planning a future they didn't own yet. It was like watching a play you already knew the ending to. I wanted to tell them to stop, to warn them that the story they'd written in their heads was about to unravel. But I didn't. I simply looked down at the folder in front of me, the one marked Estate Proceedings, Confidential. Inside it was a single page I'd slipped in earlier, one that none of them knew existed. When the door finally opened and the lawyers entered, the energy in the room shifted. Mr. Shaw nodded politely, while the woman in navy set her briefcase down with quiet precision. My mother straightened her scarf, Lydia tucked her hair behind her ear, and I just exhaled, slow, steady, prepared. Because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't going to be the day they won. This was going to be the day they learned who Grandma Evelyn really was. And when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just rewrite her legacy. It would rewrite mine. Now tell me, before we move on, if you were sitting in that room watching your mother and sister count money that might not even be theirs, what would you do first? A, speak up and confront them before the will is read. B, stay silent and let the truth reveal itself. Comment A or B below. I want to see how you handle it. When I think about my childhood, I don't remember the birthdays or the Christmases. I remember the silences that followed every argument, the invisible lines drawn between my mother's affection and my place in it. Elaine, my mother, had a gift for turning love into a reward you had to earn. Lydia never had to try. She was the sunlight of our household, and I was the shadow that made her glow brighter. Lydia's laughter could fill a room, and people adored her for it. Teachers, neighbors, even our grandmother, at least on the surface, seemed charmed by her energy. I used to watch her twirl through life as if she were on an invisible stage, her every move effortless and magnetic. Meanwhile, I learned to survive in the quiet spaces she left behind, the places where no one was clapping. Elaine was proud of how beautiful Lydia was. "You have your grandmother's smile," she'd say, brushing Lydia's hair before dinner parties, "and your father's charm." Then her gaze would drift toward me. "Grace, dear, stand up straight." That was her version of affection, instruction disguised as care. Our father died when I was 12, long before I could understand what kind of man he really was. After the funeral, our house became a stage for Elaine's need to be admired. She would host small get-togethers, wine, candles, forced laughter, and tell people she was rebuilding. She rebuilt her image, not her family. I became the invisible scaffolding that held up her show. I learned to pay the bills she forgot, to keep her secrets, to comfort Lydia when the yelling got too loud. By the time Lydia turned 16, she had already perfected the art of being adored. Boys lined up for her attention. Teachers excused her lateness. Elaine called her my star. I didn't begrudge her. I just wondered what it felt like to be loved without earning it. I remember one summer afternoon vividly. Boston was heavy with heat, the kind that sticks to your skin. Grandma Evelyn came over for tea, her linen dress crisp and her voice steady as ever. Lydia floated in late, wearing a sundress and sunglasses, humming a tune she'd written for some school performance. Elaine clapped as if Lydia had performed on Broadway. Evelyn smiled politely, then turned to me. "Help me with the tea, Grace." In the kitchen, she said quietly, "You don't need to compete with her." I must have looked confused because she added, "Some people bloom loud, others bloom deep. Roots don't get attention, but they hold everything up." That was Evelyn, always speaking in metaphors, as if she knew one day I'd have to decode them. I didn't realize she was giving me armor. Elaine's gambling started around that time. At first, it was a fun night out with friends at the casino in Connecticut. Then it was weekends. Then it was secret trips, pawn jewelry, tears that came only when she lost. I found receipts stuffed in drawers, credit card bills paid late, and once, a pawn ticket for the bracelet Lydia had given her for Mother's Day. I didn't tell Lydia. What good would it do to pull her into the storm? Evelyn knew. She didn't confront Elaine directly. She was too strategic for that. But she started visiting more often. She'd bring cookies and conversation, asking about our lives with a tone that was deceptively casual. "Are you keeping up with school, Grace?" she'd ask. "Still taking care of everyone, I see." There was warmth in her eyes, but also awareness, as if she was quietly cataloging every piece of our family's chaos. By my mid-20s, the distance between me and my mother had become an unspoken truth. I worked full-time at a small accounting firm downtown. Lydia pursued a degree in communications but never finished. She got bored easily, floating from one idea to another, always cushioned by Elaine's insistence that she just needs time to find herself. Finding herself, apparently, required new clothes, new phones, and weekend trips to the Cape. When the bills came, Elaine would sigh dramatically and say, "We're just in a rough patch, Grace. You understand." Yes, I always understood. That was my role, to understand. Sometimes, in the rare quiet of Sunday mornings, I'd go to Grandma Evelyn's house. She lived just outside the city, in a modest colonial with ivy climbing the walls and the faint smell of chamomile lingering in the air. Her world felt different, slower, intentional. The first few times I visited, she asked me to help organize her paperwork. Then it became a ritual. We'd make tea, sit at her wooden table, and sort through documents. "This one's for the inn," she'd say, or "Don't lose that. It's for the publishing company." I thought it was strange that she had so many projects. She called them hobbies. I didn't question it. I liked spending time with her. She made me feel seen. She'd tell me about her younger years, how she once turned a single catering gig into a small business, how she learned to read balance sheets before most men of her generation even allowed women near the books. There was something electric in her stories, a quiet defiance wrapped in gentleness. One evening, when I was about 27, she looked at me and said, "Your mother sees money as a rescue. You see it as responsibility. That's the difference." She said it so calmly, as if stating a fact about the weather. By then, Elaine's gambling had escalated again. The collectors called the house, polite at first, then insistent. Lydia pretended not to notice, always sure someone else would clean up the mess. I became that someone else. I negotiated with creditors, consolidated debts, and hid overdue notices from my mother's social circle. I thought I was keeping us safe. I didn't realize I was only delaying the fall. It was around this time that Evelyn started involving me more directly in her projects. She invited me to sit in on meetings with lawyers and managers. "You should understand how things work," she'd say. "Someday, you'll need to." I assumed she meant I'd have to help manage her small estate when she was gone. I didn't grasp the scope of what she'd built, or why she trusted me with it instead of Elaine. Lydia never joined those meetings. She didn't see the point. You and Grandma are adorable, she'd laugh. But spreadsheets make my skin crawl. Elaine encouraged her indifference. Let Grace handle the boring stuff, she'd say. You focus on being happy. Being happy seemed to come naturally to Lydia. Responsibility did not. Looking back, I realized Evelyn was conducting her own quiet assessment, watching how each of us handled the small tests of life. The way Lydia flitted from one dream to another, the way Elaine gambled stability for the illusion of control, the way I kept showing up, no matter how invisible I felt. In our family, love was never given equally. But respect, I would learn, could be earned in silence. By the time Evelyn's health began to decline, I wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore. Not to her. I was her confidant, her student, the one she trusted with truths too heavy for anyone else. When she'd say, "You're stronger than they think," I didn't know she meant it literally. I didn't know she was building something behind the scenes that would one day test that strength in ways I couldn't yet imagine. All I knew then was this. In a family where praise was currency, I had learned to live without it. But in that emptiness, I'd also learned something more powerful: how to see clearly, how to stand alone, and how to survive when the applause stops. And that, though I didn't realize it yet, was the one inheritance my mother and sister would never be able to touch. The morning of the reading felt like the calm before a storm that everyone else was too distracted to notice. I woke before dawn, long before the noise of Boston stirred outside my apartment windows. The city was still, blanketed in that soft gray haze that happens right before sunrise, when everything looks fragile and full of possibility. I made coffee but couldn't taste it. The weight of what was coming sat in my chest like a secret too large to hold and too important to release. I had spent the night before pacing through my living room, thinking about Grandma Evelyn's final words to me. When truth comes due, it rarely knocks, it just walks in, she had said. Back then, I hadn't understood what she meant. But that morning, as I dressed carefully in a navy blazer she'd once complimented, I realized she'd been preparing me for this moment, for the stillness before revelation. When I arrived at the law office on Beacon Hill, the air smelled faintly of old wood and fresh polish. The receptionist recognized me and offered a polite, almost pitying smile. "They're already inside," she said quietly, as though she sensed something unspoken in the air. "They've been waiting long?" I asked. "About 20 minutes," she said. "Your mother seems eager." Of course she was. My mother's version of patience was just polished impatience. I thanked the receptionist and walked down the hallway, my heels soft against the carpet. Through the frosted glass door, I could hear Lydia's laughter, high, melodic, and practiced. She had always known how to fill silence with sound. When I opened the door, the room was exactly as I had imagined. My mother standing near the window, her posture perfect, her eyes alive with anticipation. Lydia perched beside her, scrolling through her phone, a picture of casual confidence. They both looked up when I entered. "Well, finally," Elaine said, her tone light but lined with disapproval. "You almost missed the fun." Lydia grinned, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "We were just talking about what Grandma might have left. Mom thinks it'll mostly be sentimental things, but I told her maybe Grandma finally listened to my ideas about redecorating the lake house." I took a slow breath, placing my bag neatly beside the chair farthest from them. "I guess we'll find out soon enough." The sunlight coming through the tall windows caught on Lydia's earrings, scattering tiny glints across the conference table. The room felt too warm, or maybe that was just the tension pressing against my ribs. My mother adjusted her scarf, her favorite one, the silk-patterned one she wore when she wanted to feel untouchable. I just hope she didn't make things complicated. Elaine said, glancing toward the door as if she could summon the lawyer with her impatience alone. "Simple is best." Evelyn always had a flair for the dramatic. "She was careful, not dramatic," I said before I could stop myself. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Elaine looked at me, a small, tight smile forming on her lips. "Of course, dear, but sometimes people mistake caution for control." I didn't answer. There was no point. For her, silence was an admission. For me, it was protection. I looked around the room, the dark paneling, the shelves lined with law books, the antique clock ticking with relentless precision. Every detail felt deliberate, as though this space had been designed for revelations and reckonings. Somewhere in that quiet hum of anticipation, I could almost feel Evelyn's presence again. I remembered her small kitchen table, the way she'd pour chamomile tea into her favorite mug, always with the same careful rhythm. "Grace," she'd said once, "most people think power shows up loud and fast, but real power builds itself in silence, you'll see." At the time, I thought she was talking about business. Now I knew she was talking about people. The door opened, and the attorneys entered. Mr. Shaw carried a thin stack of papers, his expression grave but kind. Behind him walked a woman I'd never met before, sharp, confident, with a sleek navy suit and a briefcase she guarded like a vault. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "Two lawyers," she whispered. "Since when does a simple will require two lawyers?" Lydia leaned closer to her. "Maybe Grandma had investments or something," she said lightly, though her voice carried a faint tremor of curiosity. I stayed quiet, watching the woman with the briefcase take her seat. Her movements were controlled, economical, someone used to handling secrets of substance. Mr. Shaw cleared his throat. "Thank you for being here today. I understand this is an emotional time. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that Miss Whitmore's estate was prepared meticulously. There will be time for questions afterward." My mother nodded impatiently, already poised at the edge of her chair. Lydia smiled expectantly. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited. While Mr. Shaw shuffled papers, I found myself remembering the last few months of Evelyn's life. She'd slowed down, yes, but her mind was as sharp as ever. Our Tuesday and Thursday meetings continued even when she grew tired. We'd sit in her sunroom surrounded by plants she called her board of directors. She would talk about legacy, the way other people talked about groceries. Practical, necessary, never abstract. One afternoon, she'd asked me, "Grace, do you know why your mother gambles?" I'd hesitated, unsure if it was a question or a trap. "Because she thinks she's lucky?" Evelyn smiled softly. "No, because she's terrified of earning. Luck feels easier than effort when you've spent your life chasing approval. You, on the other hand, understand effort. That's rarer than luck." I hadn't known what to say then, but now, sitting in that polished office surrounded by the ghosts of expectation, her words echoed with new meaning. Mr. Shaw began reading formal introductions about the estate, but my mother wasn't listening. She was already planning. I could see it in the way she whispered to Lydia, in the way her fingers tapped impatiently on the table. Lydia's smile faltered only once, when Mr. Shaw mentioned the words, "additional documentation." That was when the woman with the briefcase, Margaret Cole, as I would later learn, shifted slightly, her eyes scanning the room as though she were measuring it. My heartbeat steadied. I knew that movement. I'd seen it in Evelyn before she made one of her famous adjustments, when she rearranged a deal, rewrote a contract, or set the stage for something no one else saw coming. I wanted to look at my mother, to see if she felt the same undercurrent of change, but she was too busy basking in her own fantasy of victory. "Let's hope this doesn't take long," Elaine said, her tone clipped. "I have appointments this afternoon." "I'm sure it won't," I said quietly. Inside, though, I knew that nothing about what was about to happen would be short or simple. It was the pause before an earthquake, the breath before thunder. The ornate clock ticked louder. The air grew heavier. Lydia checked her phone one last time, and my mother smoothed her scarf again, completely unaware that the world she thought she controlled was about to collapse beneath her. And me? I sat still, waiting for the moment Evelyn had spent years preparing me for. The moment when silence would finally speak louder than noise. The sound of paper rustling was the only thing that seemed alive in that still, heavy room. Mr. Shaw cleared his throat softly, a habitual gesture of formality that felt almost sacred in that moment. My mother straightened her shoulders, Lydia smoothed her skirt, and I sat perfectly still. Outside, Boston's late autumn light spilled across the window panes, dust motes drifting like suspended time. It was the kind of day when you could sense that something was about to shift, even if no one else could see it yet. Mr. Shaw began with the traditional language of law, phrases that drained emotion from meaning. "This is the last will and testament of Miss Evelyn Whitmore," he said, his voice low but steady. Lydia and Elaine both leaned forward as if they were front-row spectators at a show that had been written exclusively for them. My mother's lips curved upward in what could only be described as a victorious smile. I had seen it before. At charity dinners, at Lydia's high school graduation, even at the casino when she won a single hand. It was the expression of someone who believed that luck always favored her, even when life had proven otherwise. To my granddaughter, Lydia Dalrymple, Mr. Shaw continued, I leave my lake house in Kennebunkport, Maine, along with all furnishings, fixtures, and personal items contained within. I also leave her my jewelry collection and the contents of my savings account at First Harbor Bank. There was a beat of silence before Lydia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh my God, the house, she whispered. Mom, the house. Elaine's eyes glistened with relief that looked dangerously close to greed. She reached for Lydia's hand, squeezing it like a victory ribbon. I told you, she said softly. She always loved you best. Mr. Shaw paused, glancing briefly in my direction before continuing. To my granddaughter, Grace Whitmore, I leave my personal journals and the contents of the locked file box in my home office. The words floated across the table like ash, light, gray, and easily dismissed. My mother blinked, then laughed under her breath. It wasn't cruel laughter, not yet. It was the laughter of disbelief, the sound of someone who just realized that the universe had decided to reinforce her worldview one more time. Oh, Grace, she said with a small sigh, you always did enjoy reading. Journals suit you. Lydia gave me an apologetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. Maybe Grandma wrote something sweet in them, she offered, her tone too light, too careful. You can publish them or something. Make them into a book. I didn't answer. My fingers rested on the edge of the table, the wood cool beneath my skin. Somewhere deep inside, my pulse remained steady. It wasn't the stillness of defeat. It was the stillness of certainty. Because I knew something neither of them did. Those personal journals held the key to a legacy they couldn't even imagine. But that wasn't the moment to speak. That moment was meant for them, to reveal exactly who they were when they believed the world had given them everything they wanted. Elaine dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a tissue, though I could tell there were no tears. Evelyn would be so proud, she murmured. She adored you, Lydia. She always said you had her spirit. I could almost hear Evelyn's voice in my head, sharp and amused. No, Elaine, I said she has your appetite. My mother turned toward me, her expression softening into the kind of pity that stings worse than anger. You shouldn't feel bad, Grace. Your grandmother cared for you too, just in her own, practical way. Maybe those journals have life lessons or something. That's valuable, isn't it? It was the tone she used when she wanted to sound compassionate while reminding me of my place. I simply nodded, keeping my voice quiet. I'm sure they'll mean a lot. The clock on the wall ticked, each second drawing out the thin thread of civility that held us together. Mr. Shaw shuffled his papers, looking slightly uncomfortable. There was more to read. He knew it, I knew it. But he followed procedure. The surface calm had to hold a little longer. Elaine and Lydia had already moved on to planning. We'll need to renovate, Lydia said, her voice bright again. The lake house could be stunning. Maybe white oak floors, quartz counters, something light and coastal. That's exactly what I was thinking, Elaine said, glowing with approval. And the jewelry. Well, we'll get it appraised. Evelyn had exquisite taste, and those sapphires must be worth a small fortune. Their voices rose and fell in rhythm, feeding off each other's certainty. It was a familiar duet, the harmony of entitlement. I'd listened to it all my life. I let my gaze drift toward the window. Beyond it, the city pulsed with quiet life. People crossing streets, taxis idling, sunlight glancing off glass towers. It felt surreal to sit in that ornate office while they spoke so casually about tearing apart the life of a woman who had built everything with her bare hands. They didn't see the contradiction in calling her sentimental while dividing her possessions like prizes. I thought of Evelyn's hands, veined but steady, turning the pages of her ledgers, her voice clear as she said, "Never mistake silence for weakness, Grace. Sometimes it's the loudest strategy of all." The lawyer's voice cut back into the present. That concludes the reading of the will's primary provisions. His tone carried a subtle note, a hesitation that brushed against the edges of curiosity. I saw it in his eyes. There was more, and he knew it. Elaine, oblivious, was already halfway through listing what she'd do with the inheritance. "We'll sell the jewelry first," she said to Lydia. "Then we'll start on the kitchen remodel." "Oh, we'll have to invite the family for the holidays. It'll be the perfect way to honor your grandmother." Lydia laughed softly, glowing under her mother's praise. "I'll start making mood boards, maybe a home office by the window overlooking the lake." They spoke as if the house were already theirs, as if the ink on the will had dried decades ago. Their confidence was almost poetic in its ignorance. Then Mr. Shaw did something unexpected. He didn't close the folder. Instead, he placed his glasses on the table and exchanged a glance with the woman sitting beside him, the one with the briefcase. "Before we conclude," he said carefully, "there are additional documents regarding assets outside of the estate." Elaine froze, just for a moment, the word additional catching like a burr in her throat. "Additional?" she repeated. "I thought Evelyn's finances were straightforward." The woman, who I would later learn was attorney Margaret Cole, smiled politely, though there was something in her eyes that resembled quiet confidence. "We'll address that shortly," she said, her voice calm but purposeful. My mother's expression shifted, a flicker of irritation passing through her perfect composure. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Well, let's hope this doesn't take all day." Lydia, oblivious to the tension, giggled. "Maybe Grandma left something sentimental for the charities. She was always donating to those little causes." Mr. Shaw didn't respond. He gathered the papers, aligned them precisely, and nodded to Miss Cole, who began unlocking the briefcase. In that instant, I felt the air change. It wasn't dramatic, no thunderclap, no cinematic music. Just a subtle tightening, as if the room itself understood what the humans inside it didn't yet, that the story was about to turn, that the illusion was about to crack. Elaine glanced at Lydia, confusion knitting her brow. Lydia tilted her head, the laughter gone now, replaced by something uncertain. They didn't know it yet, but the world they believed they'd inherited was already slipping out from under them. And I, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, felt the faintest pull at the corner of my mouth. Not a smile, just a recognition. The beginning of the end had finally arrived. The click of the briefcase echoed louder than it should have in that paneled room. Margaret Cole placed it on the table with deliberate grace, as though she'd performed this ritual hundreds of times before. My mother and sister leaned forward, the way gamblers do when the dealer flips the final card. I could see the anticipation flicker in their eyes, that restless hunger that always lived between them. A mix of greed and fear, disguised as excitement. Margaret's hands were steady as she pulled out a thick folder bound in navy. "Before we finalize today's proceedings," she began, her voice measured and calm, "I'd like to address a portion of Miss Whitmore's estate not covered under the will Mr. Shaw has just read." Elaine frowned. "Not covered? I don't understand. Evelyn didn't have much else. Her savings, the house, the jewelry." Margaret's gaze lifted, her tone polite but firm. "With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, your mother's estate was far more complex than most people realized." The air seemed to still. Even the clock on the wall felt quieter. Lydia laughed nervously, glancing at her phone as though the absurdity of the moment might dissipate if she ignored it long enough. "You must be mistaken. Grandma lived in a tiny house. She drove a 10-year-old Volvo. She wasn't exactly wealthy." Margaret placed several documents on the table, spreading them neatly before us. "Appearances," she said softly, "can be deceiving. Over the past 24 years, Miss Whitmore built and managed a series of privately held businesses, 6 in total, operating under a trust known as the Evelyn Whitmore Legacy Trust. She did so quietly, through legitimate corporate channels, and each enterprise remains active and profitable." Lydia's jaw slackened. "Businesses?" she repeated, the word foreign on her tongue. Elaine reached for one of the documents, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she scanned the letterhead. The names meant nothing to her at first. Harborview Inn, Bay Lantern Publishing, Meridian Consulting, The Artisan Table, Back Bay Books, New England Logistics, but I watched the realization dawn slowly as the numbers beneath them came into focus. These can't be right," she whispered. "These valuations." "They are accurate as of last quarter," Margaret said, folding her hands neatly. Miss Whitmore was quite diligent about her reporting. The combined estimated value of her holdings exceeds $18 million. Silence fell so completely that I could hear the hum of the ceiling light. My mother blinked, once, twice, as though her brain couldn't compute the information. Lydia stared at me, then back at Margaret, her mouth slightly open. "You're saying Grandma Evelyn was a millionaire?" Lydia finally managed. "Multiple times over?" "Indeed," Margaret replied. "She preferred to live modestly to protect her privacy. Few outside her inner circle were aware of her portfolio." My mother's confusion twisted into indignation. "That doesn't make sense. Why would she hide something like that? Why didn't she tell us?" Margaret met her gaze evenly. Miss Whitmore was cautious. She believed discretion was necessary to safeguard her assets from potential financial exposure, particularly related to certain patterns of debt within the family. The color drained from Elaine's face. "Patterns of debt?" she repeated quietly, as though she couldn't bear to name the truth outright. Mr. Shaw cleared his throat delicately, but didn't intervene. The room had shifted. The balance of power was moving like a tide, slow but unstoppable. Margaret opened another folder. "As the trustee and corporate attorney overseeing Miss Whitmore's business interests, it is my duty to inform you that she prepared an extensive succession plan 18 months ago. It was executed, notarized, and filed according to Massachusetts law. The designated successor for all business operations and assets is one individual." Elaine sat up straighter. "Well, of course it's Lydia," she said quickly, her voice brittle. "She was Grandma's favorite. She always said Lydia reminded her of herself." Margaret didn't smile. She simply turned her gaze toward me. "The named successor," she said quietly, "is Ms. Grace Whitmore." It was as though the world inhaled and forgot how to exhale. Elaine's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Lydia's phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a muted thud. I didn't move. I just looked at the neat stack of documents that bore my name and Evelyn's familiar looping signature. I had seen those signatures before, on ledgers and contracts and trust papers, but seeing them now, in front of the people who had always doubted me, felt like a secret finally breathing free air. "No," my mother said finally, shaking her head. "That can't be right. Grace doesn't know anything about running businesses. She's an accountant. She's—" Her voice faltered as she searched for a word that wouldn't make her sound cruel, but the truth was she couldn't imagine me as capable of anything grand. "She's not prepared." "On the contrary," Margaret said gently, "Miss Whitmore spent the past 3 years meeting regularly with her grandmother to learn the operations, financial structures, and strategic plans for each company. Evelyn documented her training sessions meticulously. I have the records here." Lydia's eyes filled with tears, part rage, part disbelief. "You knew?" she whispered. "All this time you knew?" I met her gaze evenly. "I promised Grandma I'd keep her confidence. She wanted to protect what she built until it was strong enough to survive the truth." Elaine slammed her palm on the table, the sound sharp against the wood. "This is manipulation. Evelyn was old. She didn't know what she was doing. You must have convinced her somehow." Margaret's tone hardened slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, I assure you, your mother was of sound mind. She underwent a full cognitive evaluation 6 months before signing these documents. She was clear, deliberate, and fully aware of her choices." Elaine's fury faltered. Beneath the anger was something more painful, recognition. She knew she'd been outmaneuvered, and not by me alone, but by the woman she had underestimated all her life. Lydia's voice cracked. "But why her? Why Grace?" I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. "Because I listened," I said quietly. "Because when Grandma tried to teach, I didn't dismiss her. She wanted someone who understood the difference between managing wealth and preserving it." My mother looked at me as if seeing a stranger. "You must think you've won," she said bitterly. "This isn't about winning," I replied. "It's about trust." Mr. Shaw gathered his papers, his expression unreadable. Margaret slid the documents back into the folder, the faint click of the metal clasp punctuating the end of the announcement. For a long time, no one spoke. The silence was heavier than grief, sharper than anger. Elaine finally leaned back in her chair, staring at some point beyond the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "She planned this," she said. "Every step. She wanted to humiliate me." I shook my head. "No, Mom. She wanted to protect what she built from the kind of destruction she'd already witnessed too many times." Margaret stood, gathering the files into her briefcase once more. "There will, of course, be a formal transfer process." Miss Whitmore, she said, turning to me, we'll schedule meetings next week to review operations. Your grandmother left detailed transition instructions. I nodded, my throat tight with something between gratitude and awe. When they left the room, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything my grandmother had orchestrated, every lesson she'd hidden in plain sight. Lydia sat frozen, her perfect composure shattered. My mother looked smaller somehow, as though the gravity of her own choices had finally begun to settle. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the weight of responsibility, the echo of Evelyn's voice saying, "Real love doesn't make noise, it makes plans." And I realized she hadn't just left me a fortune. She'd left me the quiet power to rewrite our family's story, and the courage to face the storm she knew would come next. In the weeks that followed Evelyn's death, I often found myself returning to her home, not because I had to, but because I couldn't stay away. The place felt suspended in time, caught between memory and presence. The faint scent of her chamomile tea still lingered in the kitchen, and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway filled the silence that now belonged to her absence. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a heartbeat, hers echoing through the walls she'd filled with plans. When Evelyn was alive, I used to think she invited me over for company. Only later did I realize that those afternoons were lessons disguised as affection. She never sat me down to teach in a formal sense. Instead, she wove wisdom into the rhythm of our days. It began simply with her asking for help organizing her office. Her desk had always been a labyrinth of papers, receipts, ledgers, handwritten notes on scraps of envelopes. "A messy desk," she'd say, "isn't a flaw, it's a map. You just have to know how to read it." She started with numbers, balance sheets, quarterly reports, invoices from places I didn't recognize. "These aren't my bills," she told me once with a small smile. "They're pieces of stories. Each business tells its own version of the truth." I learned that her so-called little hobbies were far from small. The Harbor View Inn in Cape Ann wasn't just a local bed and breakfast. It was a thriving coastal retreat she'd purchased quietly 20 years earlier and transformed into a cornerstone of the community. The publishing house, Bay Lantern, had been her passion project, one she nurtured to give voice to writers whose stories might otherwise be lost. And then there was the consulting firm, the artisan foods company, the bookstore in Back Bay, and the logistics company that ensured hospitals received what they needed before shortages even made the news. It was like discovering that the woman who taught me to bake and sew and send thank you notes had also been orchestrating an empire behind closed doors. "Why me?" I asked her once. "Why not tell Mom or Lydia about any of this?" Evelyn had smiled, setting her teacup down on its saucer with deliberate care. "Because you ask questions that come from curiosity, not from entitlement. You want to understand, not to own." I didn't understand the full meaning then, but her words stayed with me, carving small spaces in my heart that would later grow into something solid and unshakable. Our meetings evolved over time. What started as afternoons sorting documents turned into structured sessions, financial reviews, leadership discussions, and even mock decision-making exercises. She made me read corporate reports, highlight trends, and present summaries back to her. It felt strange at first, like being tested in a subject I hadn't known I was studying. But there was pride in her eyes every time I got something right. "You see the patterns," she'd say. "That's what matters. Numbers are only symbols. Understanding is the real currency." She taught me patience, the kind that comes from tending to things that grow slowly. When I wanted to rush through a problem, she'd stop me. "Take a walk by the Charles," she'd say. "When you come back, the answer will be waiting." And she was always right. I'd return to find clarity where confusion had once been. Some days, she didn't talk about business at all. She talked about life, how she'd grown up during a time when women had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously, how she'd learned to make herself indispensable in rooms that didn't want her there. "Respect," she said, "isn't something you're given. It's something you make impossible to ignore." She would tell me stories from her younger years, how she'd convinced a banker to give her a small business loan in the 1970s by pretending to be her own assistant. "He never even realized I was both women," she said, laughing. "By the time he did, I'd already paid off the loan." Those stories weren't just entertainment. They were blueprints, lessons disguised as laughter. But it wasn't all strategy. There were softer moments, too. Evening walks where she'd loop her arm through mine, pointing out the way the light reflected on the water. Sundays when we'd visit the inn just to greet the staff and have coffee in the dining room, watching guests read newspapers or talk quietly over breakfast. She knew every employee's name, their children's names, their favorite desserts. People remember how you make them feel, not how much you pay them, she'd remind me. Business without empathy is just a different kind of greed. Over time, the inn became my second home. Evelyn would take me into the kitchen and introduce me to Rosa, the breakfast cook, who'd been with her for over a decade. Rosa called Evelyn the quiet hurricane. She changes everything, Rosa said once, but she never makes a mess doing it. I never forgot that. Evelyn started giving me responsibilities, small at first, then larger. I handled budgets, vendor negotiations, even hiring decisions. Every success she celebrated with a nod. Every mistake she turned into a lesson. Never apologize for learning, she'd say. Apologies are for harm, not for growth. There was one evening, late in winter, when snow fell thick over Boston and the world seemed muffled in white. Evelyn had made her favorite soup, carrot and ginger, and we sat by the window, watching the flakes spiral past the streetlights. That was when she told me about the trust. I've arranged things, she said quietly, her voice soft but unwavering. The businesses, the properties, they're structured to protect themselves, and the people who depend on them, from those who might see them as trophies instead of responsibilities. I knew she meant my mother. You're giving me too much, I whispered. I'm giving you the tools to do what's right, she said. You won't use them to build walls, Grace. You'll use them to open doors. She reached for my hand then, her skin thin but warm. You've spent your life learning how to stand in the background, but one day, the background will need a voice. Promise me you won't hide when that day comes. I promised her. The months that followed were filled with preparation, legal meetings, silent rehearsals for a performance no one else knew was coming. Evelyn was meticulous, documenting every reason behind her decisions. She wanted no room for doubt, no space for manipulation. And through it all, she never let bitterness creep in. Don't fight them with anger, she'd remind me. Let truth do the fighting. It's quieter, but it always wins. When she grew weaker, I took over more of the daily work. I managed correspondence, attended staff meetings in her place, and signed documents she'd already reviewed. Each task felt sacred, a piece of her trust placed carefully in my hands. The last time we sat together, the spring light was just beginning to warm the city. She looked at me with that mix of pride and peace that comes only when someone has finished what they started. It's all set, she said. Whatever happens, remember, you're not inheriting power. You're inheriting purpose. I didn't know how to thank her then. Words felt too small. Now, standing in the echo of her home, surrounded by the quiet proof of her faith in me, I finally understood. Our bond had never been about money. It had been about preparation, about passing on a strength that wasn't loud but lasting. And though she was gone, I could still hear her voice every time I hesitated. Steady, certain, patient. You're ready, Grace. Now go be the lighthouse. The silence that followed the revelation was a living thing, heavy and pulsing, as if the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Elaine sat rigid in her chair, her hand frozen around the pen she'd been fiddling with moments earlier. Lydia's eyes darted between Margaret, Mr. Shaw, and me, her face pale with disbelief. The only sound was the low ticking of the clock above the door, a quiet reminder that time, at least, was still moving forward, even if none of us could. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but her words cut through the quiet like glass. There are some additional matters we need to address regarding the personal estate, specifically, certain liens that have been filed against assets now designated to Miss Dalrymple. Lydia blinked. Liens? She repeated, as if she'd never heard the word before. Margaret nodded. Yes, your grandmother's house in Kennebunkport and her jewelry collection were technically part of her personal assets, which passed through the will. However, due to outstanding judgments against your mother's name, several creditors have placed legal claims on those properties. The assets cannot be transferred until those debts are resolved. Elaine's face went white. That's not possible, she said quickly. shaking her head. My debts are personal. They can't touch Evelyn's property. Ordinarily, no, Margaret replied. But there's a clause in the judgment that allows for attachment to any inheritance or transfer of property that directly benefits a debtor or her immediate household. Since the property was left to your daughter and you share financial dependency with her, those assets are now subject to seizure. For the first time in my life, I watched my mother lose her composure completely. No, she whispered, clutching at the arm of her chair. That can't be. I was finally getting a second chance. Lydia turned toward her wide-eyed. Mom, what is she talking about? What debts? Elaine pressed her fingers to her temples, her voice breaking. It's complicated. I was going to fix it. I just needed time. Lydia's confusion cracked into anger. You said you were fine. You said it was under control. Her mother's shoulders sagged. It was supposed to be, she murmured. Evelyn never should have. She stopped herself, catching the edge of her own accusation. Evelyn never should have known. But of course, Evelyn had known everything. I sat quietly, not to gloat, but because there was nothing I could say that would make it easier. Watching them crumble wasn't satisfying. It was sobering. This was the exact fallout Evelyn had predicted, the moment when truth and consequence finally met. Margaret continued carefully. Given the value of the debts and the existing liens, both the property and the jewelry will need to be sold to satisfy the obligations. It's unlikely there will be any residual funds once the process concludes. Lydia's voice was small now, almost childlike. So, I get nothing? Mr. Shaw interjected softly. You will receive any remaining balance, if there is one, after the debts are settled. Elaine let out a choked sound, something between a sob and a bitter laugh. She planned this, she said. Evelyn planned every bit of this. She left me with nothing and made sure I couldn't touch a dime. Margaret didn't deny it. Your mother was deliberate, she said. She wanted to ensure her businesses and the people they supported were protected. She believed this arrangement would bring clarity to her family's circumstances. Clarity? Elaine spat, the venom returning to her voice. She wanted to punish me. She wanted to protect her work. I said quietly, There's a difference. My mother turned on me then, her eyes wet but furious. Don't you dare pretend you're the victim here, Grace. You've always been waiting for this, haven't you? For me to fail. I met her gaze evenly. I spent my whole life trying to keep you from failing. Grandma did too. You just never wanted help that came with accountability. For a long time, she said nothing. Her anger, so quick to flare, seemed to collapse inward, leaving behind something smaller, hollower. Lydia slumped in her chair, her earlier poise gone. What am I supposed to do now? She whispered. You told me the house was mine. You said we'd be fine. Elaine reached for her, but Lydia flinched away. You lied, she said. You always lied. The words hung between them like smoke. Mr. Shaw cleared his throat gently. If I may, he said, I believe there's still an opportunity for understanding here. Miss Whitmore, he looked at me. Your grandmother left a letter addressed to your family. She asked that it be read once all other matters were concluded. I nodded. I have it with me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope I'd been carrying for weeks. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant cursive, steady even in old age. My mother stared at it as though it might burn her. Lydia didn't look at all. I unfolded the paper slowly and began to read. My dearest Elaine and Lydia, if you are hearing this, it means my affairs have been settled, and what I kept hidden has now been revealed. You may feel angry, shocked, or betrayed. I understand. But know that I made these choices not out of cruelty, but out of love. The kind of love that protects even when it hurts. Elaine, I have watched you lose more than money. I have watched you lose yourself. I wanted to give you a chance to rebuild, but you cannot build on denial. The truth must come first. Lydia, you have inherited your mother's charm, but not her discipline. The world will not always applaud you. Learn to earn what you expect. And Grace, my quiet lighthouse, you have carried burdens that were never yours. Now they are your responsibility by choice, not by accident. Use what I've built to create, not to destroy. Remember that wealth is only a tool. It becomes power only when guided by integrity. I paused. The room was still except for the sound of my mother's uneven breathing. She wrote more, I said, my throat tight. She wrote, Forgiveness is the final act of strength. You will all need to find it. Toward me, toward each other, and toward yourselves. When I looked up, Lydia was crying. Elaine was staring down at her lap, her face unreadable. For a long time, no one spoke. Eventually, Margaret and Mr. Shaw gathered their papers and quietly excused themselves, leaving us alone in the quiet. The sound of the door closing felt final, like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Elaine broke the silence first. "So that's it?" she said softly. "We start over? Just like that?" I hesitated. Starting over doesn't erase what happened. It just means you stop pretending it didn't. She looked at me for a long moment, then at Lydia. For the first time in years, her expression wasn't hardened by pride. It was tired, frightened, human. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted. "You don't have to know," I said. "You just have to want to." Lydia wiped her tears and gave a small, trembling nod. "What about us?" she asked. "What do we do now?" "You live," I said. "You work. You learn how to stand on your own feet. Grandma gave all of us a lesson. Some of us just have to learn it the hard way." Outside, the light had shifted. The long shadows of late afternoon stretched across the room, touching each of us differently. For a brief moment, I thought of Evelyn, how she had predicted this very scene, how she had known that truth, once unleashed, could break a family only so it could rebuild itself again. I stood, gathering my things. "We'll be all right," I said quietly, "but we won't ever be the same." And maybe that, I thought as I walked out into the cool air of Beacon Hill, was exactly what she intended. The weeks that followed felt both unreal and inevitable, like living inside a storm that had finally learned how to quiet itself. The lawyer's visits, the signatures, the board introductions, all of it blurred together into a steady hum of motion. Each day brought a new document to review, a new face to meet, a new responsibility to absorb. I moved through it calmly, anchored by the voice that still echoed inside me, Evelyn's voice. Steady, deliberate, reminding me that power was never about noise. It was about presence. The first time I walked into the Harborview Inn as its new owner, the Atlantic wind hit me like a benediction. The salt air carried the same scent it had on the afternoons when Evelyn would stand by the terrace railing and point to the horizon saying, "That's what ambition should feel like. Vast and impossible until you start walking toward it." Inside, Rosa was arranging fresh flowers on the front desk. When she saw me, her face broke into a smile tinged with something deeper. Recognition, maybe even relief. "You came back," she said simply. "I promised I would," I replied. She led me to the kitchen, where the staff was prepping breakfast for a full house. It amazed me how life continued with such quiet steadiness, even after the woman who had built it all was gone. Evelyn's systems were still in place. The ledgers organized, the menus balanced, the staff paid on time. She had built an empire that ran on integrity, not intimidation, and I intended to keep it that way. Over the next few weeks, I met with the managers of each company. The publishing team at Bay Lantern showed me their upcoming titles, filled with stories about resilience, memory, and reinvention. "Your grandmother believed in voices that get ignored," the editor told me. "She said every story that survives doubt is already a success." At the bookstore in Back Bay, I found a framed photo of Evelyn tucked behind the register. Someone had written beneath it in pen, "She made us believe small places could hold big ideas." It struck me then how carefully she had chosen her work. None of her businesses were about spectacle or showmanship. They were about sustenance, feeding people, publishing stories, connecting communities, delivering what mattered. She hadn't built an empire to be admired. She had built one to endure. Lydia took the job I offered her at the inn. At first, she looked miserable, her manicured hands awkward against the linen she folded and the trays she carried. But something softened in her over time. On her third week, she stayed late to help a guest who had fallen ill, sitting by their bedside until help arrived. When I thanked her the next day, she shrugged, embarrassed. "It just felt right," she said. I saw a flicker of Evelyn in her then, not the ambition, but the compassion. Maybe that was enough. Elaine, on the other hand, drifted between denial and remorse. For a while, she refused to see me, too ashamed or too angry to face what had become of her illusions. But eventually, one afternoon, she called. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, brittle around the edges. "I'm at the cafe near the park," she said. "Would you meet me?" When I arrived, she was sitting alone, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling in front of her. The woman who once commanded every room now looked like someone trying to remember how to take up space again. "I didn't know how far I'd fallen," she said quietly. "Evelyn saw it before I did. I think she saved me from myself." I didn't respond right away. I just watched her, wondering if humility could survive where pride had lived so long. Finally, I said, "She didn't want to save you, Mom. She wanted you to save yourself." She nodded slowly, her eyes wet. "Do you think she'd forgive me?" "I think she already did," I said. "But you still need to forgive you." After that, she started attending a support group for debt recovery. It wasn't a miracle, but it was movement. Evelyn would have approved of that. Progress over perfection, steps over promises. As for me, I found solace in the quiet rhythms of work. Each morning, I'd walk along the harbor before meetings, the same route Evelyn had taken for years. Some days, I'd stop by the publishing house or the bookstore, check on the staff, and remind them that nothing about their mission was changing. "You're still telling stories that matter," I told them. "The only difference is the signature at the bottom of the checks." One evening, as the sun sank low over the water, I stood on the balcony of the inn and thought about how strange justice can be, how it rarely arrives with applause, only with balance. Evelyn hadn't sought revenge. She had sought restoration. She didn't destroy anyone. She simply revealed the truth and let it stand on its own. That night, I wrote her a letter I'd never send. "You gave me more than businesses, Grandma. You gave me a way to understand strength without cruelty, success without arrogance. You showed me that the quietest victories are the ones that last." I folded the letter and placed it in her favorite teacup, still sitting on the shelf in my office. Months passed, and the world around us began to settle. Elaine sold what little she had left and downsized to a modest apartment. Lydia saved her paychecks and started taking online business courses. Sometimes, after her shifts at the inn, we'd sit together by the fire pit outside, the ocean wind tugging at our hair. She'd ask about Evelyn, about the woman she'd thought she knew but clearly hadn't. I told her the truth, that Evelyn was neither saint nor schemer, but something rarer, a woman who believed that love, when it's real, demands accountability. I also began a project in Evelyn's honor, the Whitmore Foundation. Its mission was simple: to help women recovering from financial hardship find stability through education, mentorship, and fair employment. We funded small grants, offered workshops, and partnered with local colleges to create opportunities for women who, like my mother once had been, were trapped by their own mistakes, but still reaching for a way out. At the foundation's first event, I stood in front of a small crowd and spoke words that I hadn't prepared, because they had been living inside me for years. My grandmother taught me that legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you set in motion. She built her life on that truth, and she gave me the honor of continuing it. The applause was warm but brief, fading into that peaceful kind of silence Evelyn would have loved. Later that evening, I walked alone down to the shoreline. The water shimmered under the moonlight, silver and endless. I thought of everything that had changed, how the same ocean that once mirrored our family's chaos now reflected its calm. I had never imagined myself as someone who could lead or own or rebuild. For most of my life, I'd been the background character in someone else's story. But standing there, the cold wind brushing against my face, I realized Evelyn had seen something in me that I hadn't yet recognized in myself. Not ambition, not pride, but endurance. Her voice came back to me, soft and sure, like a whisper carried by the tide. "Real love doesn't make noise, Grace. It makes plans." I smiled then, not because I had won, but because I had learned. The house, the companies, the money, none of it was the point. The real inheritance was the quiet strength to choose differently. As I turned to leave, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The world, as always, was beginning again. And for the first time, I didn't feel like a bystander to my own life. I felt like its architect. Evelyn had left me wealth, yes, but more than that, she had left me wisdom. And that no debt, no greed, no storm could ever take away. Grace Whitmore's story is one of quiet resilience. A woman who spent her life in the background, dismissed and underestimated, only to emerge as the rightful heir to not just a fortune, but a legacy built on integrity. Her grandmother, Evelyn, saw in her what others could not: the strength to nurture, not exploit, to lead with compassion rather than entitlement. Through years of silent preparation, Evelyn taught Grace the power of patience, foresight, and purpose. When the will was read and the truth unraveled, the revelation wasn't just about money, it was about restoration. The selfish were exposed, the deserving were elevated, and justice arrived not as vengeance, but as clarity. In the end, Grace didn't gloat or seek revenge. She rebuilt her family, her sense of self, and her grandmother's empire with the same quiet steadiness that Evelyn had modeled all her life. What once felt like invisibility transformed into quiet power, proving that dignity and strength often grow in silence. The Whitmore legacy became more than business success. It became a symbol of redemption, compassion, and the enduring truth that character outlasts circumstance. The lesson in Grace's story is profound. Life rewards those who prepare in silence and act with integrity when no one is watching. You don't have to shout to be strong, and you don't have to win every argument to prove your worth. Sometimes, the greatest triumph comes from choosing grace over resentment and letting your actions speak louder than your anger. In a world obsessed with instant recognition, this story reminds us that the most meaningful victories are often the ones no one sees coming. Now tell me, if you were in Grace's position, what would you have done? A. Forgiven your family and focused on rebuilding. B. Cut ties completely and walked away. Comment A or B below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Grace's choice and Evelyn's plan? Do you agree with how she handled it? Share your opinion in the comments so we can all reflect together. And don't forget to subscribe and support this channel so we can continue bringing you more powerful, emotional stories like this one.